On the surface, it might appear to be just another breakup, another emotional conflict, another parting, between two people who simply couldn't make it work. Yet beneath that exterior, a profound psychological and spiritual transformation is unfolding, one that alters identity, energy, and emotional perception. To truly grasp this, we must first examine the emotional pattern between these two personalities. An empath does not simply love. An empath absorbs, mirrors, steadies, and nurtures emotional atmospheres. They are deeply sensitive to the internal experiences of others. A narcissistic personality, by contrast, relies intensely on external affirmation to manage inner instability. The empath becomes more than a companion. They become an emotional regulator on a spiritual level. This forms an energetic cycle. The empath offers reassurance. The narcissist takes it in. The empath forgives. The narcissist sidesteps responsibility. The empath mends emotional fractures. The narcissist preserves control. Over time, this interaction turns into a structure of imbalance, disguised as closeness. But when the empath awakens, when they see their value and pull back their emotional investment, the structure falls apart. The first spiritual impact is the loss of reflection. A narcissistic identity is frequently built around how others react to them. Admiration becomes proof of worth. Attention becomes confirmation of existence. When the empath departs, the mirror vanishes. And without that mirror, the narcissist is confronted with raw self-perception. This can feel like an ego collapse, not because love has disappeared, but because regulation has disappeared. Emotionally healthy individuals cultivate inner stability over time. But when someone depends heavily on others to sustain self-worth, the abrupt removal of that support brings spiritual confusion. The empath's silence echoes louder than any argument ever could. Their absence removes the emotional buffer that once softened reality. And at this stage, something even deeper begins to unfold. Without the empath diffusing tension, buried insecurities rise to the surface. Old wounds that were once projected outward no longer have an outlet. Blame loses its focus. Control loses its grip. And the narcissist may feel agitation, anxiety, or an urgent desire to quickly replace the lost bond. Why? Because the nervous system has adapted to a steady stream of emotional supply. Spiritually, this becomes a direct encounter with the self. The empath's exit pushes the narcissist into facing an internal emptiness, one that was previously concealed by outside validation. But here lies the essential truth. This moment is not a punishment. It is an opening. Loss, in psychological and spiritual language, is an instructor. It removes illusions. It clears away distraction. It exposes patterns. When someone loses an empath, they lose the source of unconditional emotional repair. And without that cushion, they stand before two choices. The first option is avoidance. Searching for new admiration, repeating familiar cycles, rebuilding the ego as fast as possible. To escape discomfort, this route leads to greater fragmentation because the original wound stays unhealed. The second option is awareness. Awareness starts with unease. It begins with noticing patterns of control, defensiveness, or emotional manipulation. It begins with confronting hard questions. Why was constant validation necessary? Why did closeness feel unsafe? Spiritual growth does not arise from comfort. It emerges through confrontation. And at the same time, something just as significant is unfolding on the other side. When the empath chooses to leave, their energy flows back to them. For a long period, they may have stretched themselves too thin, over-giving, over-justifying, over-forgiving. Spiritually, this weakens identity, but separation restores it. The empath starts reclaiming clarity. Their nervous system steadies. Their intuition deepens. They come to understand that love, without mutual exchange, is not compassion. It is self-neglect. And this understanding changes everything. The narcissist may read the empath's quiet as indifference, but spiritually it represents boundary. It represents self-honor. It represents emotional maturity, selecting peace instead of chaos. The most profound transformation within this dynamic is not the narcissist's suffering. It is the empath's awakening. Because once an empath truly recognizes their worth, they do not return to dynamics that reduce them. They stop confusing intensity with intimacy. They stop mistaking control for passion. Spiritually, the separation becomes a catalyst for growth. For the narcissist, the loss dismantles illusion. For the empath, it restores a sense of self. And here lies the deeper lesson for all of us. Any relationship rooted in imbalance will eventually reach its breaking point. Emotional systems that rely on one person overfunctioning while the other resists growth cannot maintain harmony. When an empath walks away, it is not just a departure. It is the interruption of dysfunction. If growth follows, the loss turns into redemption. If denial follows, the loss becomes repetition. But in either case, something shifts permanently. So what truly occurs spiritually when a narcissist loses an empath? Illusion falls away, energy recalibrates, identity is challenged, and both individuals arrive at a crossroads. One path leads towards self-awareness, the other towards self-reclamation. The real transformation is not in the drama of the ending. It is in the inner rebuilding that comes after. And that is where authentic spiritual evolution begins. And when a narcissist loses an empath, the first and most immediate spiritual shift is the breakdown of emotional reflection, a process deeply connected to how identity has been shaped over time. In many unbalanced relationships, the empath unconsciously acts as a mirror, consistently reflecting admiration, reassurance, validation, and emotional affirmation back to the narcissistic partner. This reflection does more than elevate confidence. It supports a fragile inner framework that relies heavily on external approval to preserve self-worth. Spiritually speaking, the narcissist's identity often leans outward rather than inward. In other words, their emotional stability is regulated by others' reactions instead of an internally anchored sense of value. When the empath withdraws, no longer offering praise, no longer calming conflicts, no longer mending emotional fractures, that mirror vanishes. What remains is not just solitude, but unfiltered self-confrontation. Without the empath diffusing tension and returning reassurance, the narcissist may experience a destabilizing emptiness, as if a grounding force has suddenly been taken away. This can activate restlessness, anxiety, or an urgent drive to seek new validation because the nervous system has adapted to a continuous flow of emotional supply. The spiritual unease that follows is not simply about missing someone. It is about facing an identity that was partly formed through another's devotion. In this quiet space, unresolved insecurities rise more clearly, and defenses that once felt strong begin to appear fragile. The loss becomes a different kind of mirror, one reflecting inward rather than outward. At this point, the experience holds the possibility for awareness, because when external affirmation disappears, the essential question remains. Who am I when no one is reinforcing my value? This confrontation, though uncomfortable, marks the start of authentic self-inquiry, where identity can either be rebuilt on deeper foundations or reinforced through avoidance and repetition. And when the empath steps away, the second spiritual consequence that emerges is the awakening of emotional repercussions that were once avoided or redirected. In an imbalanced connection, the empath frequently absorbs emotional turbulence, transforming chaos into calm, anger into empathy, and distance into renewed closeness. This buffering dynamic enables the narcissistic partner to sidestep profound self-reflection because discomfort is continually softened before it fully registers. Spiritually, this fosters a pattern where actions do not feel internally costly. Blame can be projected outward and accountability can be minimized through the empath's readiness to repair. However, once that emotional safeguard is gone, there is no longer anyone cushioning the effects of behavior. Words spoken from pride, manipulative tactics used to preserve control, and dismissals of vulnerability no longer dissolve into easy forgiveness. Instead, they reverberate within the silence that follows. The nervous system, once steadied by steady reassurance, begins to experience imbalance, and long-buried wounds hidden beneath layers of ego defense start rising to awareness. This is often felt as agitation, hollowness, or a vague sense of loss that extends beyond missing companionship. Spiritually, it becomes the experience of emotional cause and effect becoming undeniable. Without someone to absorb projections, the individual is confronted with the direct imprint of their own conduct. The mind may initially resist this realization, searching for distractions or quick replacements to restore familiar cycles. Yet beneath that resistance rests an undeniable awareness that something deeper has been revealed. This revved elation can feel intimidating because it disrupts long-standing beliefs of superiority or control. Still, within that unease lies a rare chance to understand that emotional maturity demands accountability for one's effect on others. When avoidance is no longer upheld by another person's compassion, the individual is left standing directly before the emotional results of their actions. And that confrontation signals a crucial spiritual threshold. The third spiritual shift that unfolds when the empath departs is an energetic recalibration that converts attachment into independence. In an unbalanced bond, energy typically moves unevenly in one direction. The empath provides attention, reassurance, emotional effort, and patience, often sacrificing their own needs in the process. Meanwhile, the narcissistic partner becomes used to receiving this continuous stream of psychological reinforcement. Over time, this forms an attachment pattern grounded not in shared interdependence, but in dependency masked as intimacy. Spiritually, energy that constantly flows outward without equal return creates exhaustion for one and inflation for the other. When the empath chooses to detach, that energetic exchange is disrupted. The current that once fueled the narcissist's sense of importance begins returning to its origin. For the empath, this shift feels like clarity slowly replacing confusion, calm replacing hypervigilance, and confidence replacing self-doubt. Their nervous system, once trained to anticipate emotional instability, gradually steadies. Boundaries that once seemed frightening start to feel protective. At the same time, the narcissistic partner encounters instability because the reliable source of affirmation has been cut off. What once felt secure now feels uncertain. The silence that follows is not simply emptiness. It is the sound of energy no longer accessible on demand. This transition highlights the distinction between attachment rooted in need and connection grounded in reciprocity. Spiritually, autonomy arises when the empath realizes that love does not require self-erasure. By reclaiming their emotional energy, they reestablish internal balance. The dynamic that once revolved around control and validation loses its structure, and both individuals face a new reality, one in which self-regulation must develop internally rather than depend on external supply. In this rebalancing, power is not stolen or reassigned. It simply returns to where it belongs, marking the beginning of individual growth and a deeper recognition of what healthy connection truly demands. And the fourth spiritual movement that unfolds after the separation is the appearance of a crossroads, a defining inner moment where transformation becomes possible, though never guaranteed. When the familiar cycle of validation, control, and emotional repair disappears, the narcissistic individual stands before an unfamiliar internal terrain. The usual defenses, denial, projection, superiority, may still arise, but they no longer operate with the same strength because the external reinforcement sustaining them has weakened. Spiritually, this is the stage where fragmentation can either intensify or begin to mend. If avoidance persists, the discomfort of loss is quickly numbed through distraction, substitute relationships, or strengthened ego defenses. On the surface, life seems to continue as normal, yet the core wound remains unaddressed, becoming more rigid with time. This root deepens isolation because every repetition of the pattern distances the individual further from genuine intimacy. However, another path exists within that discomfort. The quiet left by the empath can become space for reflection instead of resistance. Within that space, deeper questions begin to arise. Questions about vulnerability, empathy, responsibility, and the fear that may have fueled controlling tendencies. This process of self-examination is not easy, but it is transformative. Spiritually, growth requires dismantling the illusions that once shielded the ego. It demands the humility to accept that love cannot flourish where domination replaces mutual respect. If awareness is chosen, the loss becomes catalytic rather than destructive. Patterns can be evaluated, emotional understanding can expand, and a more stable identity can gradually take shape, one no longer dependent on constant admiration. Simultaneously, the empath's departure affirms a universal truth. Boundaries are not punishments, but expressions of alignment. In this moment of choice, destiny is shaped not by the loss itself, but by the reaction to it. And that response determines whether the experience becomes a step toward evolution or a cycle endlessly repeated.